Think more, risk less. Welcome to employee training on hazard communication and the globally harmonized system. We'll be covering a lot of information on a number of slides. Feel free to pause or rewind this video should you wish to review. Employee training for hazard communication. The information in this presentation comes from ASU's Environmental Health, Safety, and Emergency Management's Policy Number 6, Hazard Communications Program, and complies with North Carolina Occupational Safety and Health's Hazard Communications Standard, 29 CFR 1910.1200. What is hazcom? Well, OSHA's Hazard Communications Standard is sometimes referred to as the Right to Know Standard, and it's a set of regulations that require employers to tell their employees about the hazards of chemicals used in the workplace. They're required to have a hazcom program, which includes employee training, access to information about chemical products used in the workplace, access to personal protective equipment, and they must have a written hazard communication plan. OSHA requires employee training, general hazard communications training, and initial employee training on the globally harmonized system, or GHS, is what we're providing today. Job-specific hazcom training is also required, and you'll receive that from your supervisor. Annual refreshers are not required except when hazards change in the workplace or the standard or policy changes. Employee training shall include at least the following. 1. How to detect the release of a hazardous chemical in the work area, such as monitoring devices, appearance, or odor. 2. The physical and health hazards associated with each chemical as specified in the material safety data sheets. As you'll learn later in this presentation, the Safety Data Sheet, or SDS, will eventually replace the MSDS. 3. Actions that employees can take to protect their own safety and health, including specific procedures that have been established for normal work practices, emergency procedures and other non-routine tasks, and the use of personal protective equipment. And 4. Details of the hazard communication program, including an explanation of the labeling system used on in-house containers of hazardous chemicals. Also, details of how employees can obtain and use information contained in the MSDS. Employee training shall occur at the time of initial assignment to an activity where exposure to hazardous chemicals may occur. Whenever new physical or health hazards are introduced and the employee has not been previously trained about those hazards, and whenever there is evidence that an employee does not understand the physical or health hazards to which he or she is exposed. Here are the rules that govern employee access to information about chemical products. 1. Each shop, area, or department must keep an up-to-date chemical inventory. 2. Each shop, area, or department must maintain material safety data sheets. And 3. Each container must be labeled in such a way that employees can look up the MSDS for the product inside that container. A chemical inventory list is a list of the hazardous chemicals found in each department, and it must be readily available to any employee. A material safety data sheet is a sheet or sheets of information on a particular chemical, prepared by the chemical manufacturer or importer, and must be readily accessible to employees in their work area. Here's an example of a material safety data sheet. Now, although OSHA has never required a particular format be used, all MSDSs must contain the following information. In this sample, Section 1 is Identification of the Chemical. Here you'll find the name and address of the manufacturer, the name of the chemical, and an emergency number to call. Section 2, Hazardous Ingredients. It's got to list all the chemicals in the product which can cause harm here, and must include legal and recommended exposure limits. Section 3 is Physical Data. Like whether it's a gas, liquid, or a solid. It may tell you about its odor and appearance as well. Section 4, Fire and Explosion Hazard Data. Here you'll find information regarding the flash point of the chemical and how to put out a fire involving the chemical. Section 5, Health Hazards. Usually tells you about the way a chemical can enter your body, through ingestion, inhalation, or absorption, and will list the acute and chronic health effects that might occur. Section 6 talks about reactivity, whether a chemical is stable or not. Section 7 is where you will find the personal protective equipment you'll need to work safe around the equipment. Section 8, Spills and Leak Procedures. And Section 9, the handling and storage of the chemical. Here's another MSDS sample. Remember, material safety data sheets will eventually be replaced with the globally harmonized systems safety data sheets. Again, we'll talk about that a little more later in this presentation. You may pause the video here if you'd like to examine this MSDS sample a little longer. Each department is responsible for ensuring that their list of chemicals is current, and that a current MSDS for each chemical used is on hand. And you must remember, out-of-date lists or MSDSs are dated and maintained for at least 30 years after ceasing to use the chemical. All chemicals on ASU property must be authorized, which means it must be approved by your supervisor, added to the department's chemical inventory list, and accompanied by its own MSDS. All unauthorized hazardous chemicals will be disposed of properly upon discovery. Labeling. All containers of hazardous chemicals must be labeled with the identity of the chemical or product name, the appropriate hazard warnings, its known or suspected cancer-causing agent, if any, or if it's known to affect a specific organ of the body. This information can be found on the chemical's original container or on the MSDS. The labeling of primary or manufacturer containers must reflect the manufacturer, the name of the product, a hazard warning, and a list of hazardous ingredients, usually located on the back or side of the container. Secondary containers are portable containers into which a hazardous chemical has been transferred from a primary labeled container. Secondary container labels should have the name or names of the chemicals in the container, as well as hazard warnings and information specific to the contents. When do secondary containers have to be labeled? Well, except for a few cases, secondary containers must be labeled. If in doubt, label it. Here are the most commonly used formats for secondary container labeling: the National Fire Protection Association, or NFPA Diamond, and the HMIS, or Hazardous Materials Identification System label. The next couple of slides explain how to read each format. Here's the NFPA label. Pause the video at this point to study and learn the NFPA label. Here's the HMIS label. Again, pause the video to study and learn the HMIS label. If you'd like a copy of How to Read NFPA and HMIS Labels, contact the EHS and EM Occupational Safety Manager at 7649. Secondary containers that are used by one person during one work shift should be labeled at least with the name of the chemical. Replace labels that are defaced or hard to read. Labels are not required on portable containers which are intended for immediate use by the employee who performs the transfer of hazardous chemical from a labeled container. Now, immediate use means under the control of and used only by that employee and within the work shift of transfer. There are 3 ways a chemical can get into your body. Ingestion, or swallowing the chemical. Inhalation, breathing the chemical in. And absorption, the chemical soaks through the skin. If you work with corrosive or caustic chemicals, locate the eye washes and emergency showers in your area and find out how they operate before you need them. Eye washes should be of a type which operate automatically, leaving both hands free so that the eyelids may be held open and rinsed thoroughly for at least 15 minutes. Showers may be operated by pulling a simple chain or by standing on a pressure plate. Once activated, the water should continue to flow, leaving both hands free to remove contaminated clothing. Be sure you get the chemical off. You should stay under the shower for at least 15 minutes. PPE, or personal protective equipment, is equipment worn by employees to protect themselves from chemicals or other hazards. Common examples include safety glasses, goggles, gloves, safety-toed shoes and slip-resistant shoes, hard hats, and respirators. By law, employers must first try to find a way to actually remove the hazard before deciding to use PPE. For example, substitution with a less hazardous chemical or adding extra ventilation must be tried before deciding that an employee should wear a respirator. ASU's EHS and EM can provide valuable assistance in deciding when PPE is appropriate, and if so, selecting the proper kind and training employees on its use. The wrong kind of PPE can give people a false sense of security and can actually increase their chances of getting hurt or sick on the job. ASU's Written Hazard Communications Program is contained in Policy 6 of EHS and EM's section in the ASU Policy Manual. This plan includes details on who is responsible for what with regards to chemical safety in non-laboratory workplaces. According to ASU's Hazard Communications Program, under Policy Purpose Applicability, to protect the safety and health of each employee, so no employee should experience any harmful effects from working with chemicals in their workplace. Hazard Communication Program Monitor. ASU's industrial hygienist monitors all related activities to ensure compliance. Department or area supervisors ensure employees follow the policy, receive the necessary information and training, use safe work practices, have the necessary PPE, and use the required PPE. Each employee is responsible for carefully following established work practices, wearing the required PPE, and promptly reporting problems. Employees are encouraged to notify EHS and EM directly or anonymously when corrective action is not taken. There is no job at Appalachian State University so vital or urgent as to justify the risk of employee overexposure to a hazardous chemical. Ask when in doubt. Proceed with a job only after being satisfied that it is safe for you to do so. When considering whether to purchase chemicals not on the department's chemical inventory list, the supervisor shall review the MSDS of the product under consideration to determine the relative hazards. The new product should also be reviewed alongside the MSDSs of any product the new product would be intended to replace. The supervisor is encouraged to consult with the industrial hygienist if he or she is unsure which product is safer. The department or area supervisor will advise contractors of any hazards, including hazardous chemicals, to which contractor employees may be exposed and the appropriate protective measures to be taken. The manager's responsibility is to determine if the contractor will be using or creating any hazardous chemicals during the work that would expose ASU employees. All such affected ASU employees must receive information and training on the hazards of such chemicals and the means to protect themselves from exposure. Planning, design, and construction is to be advised prior to any contractor performing work involving hazardous chemicals. Employee information will include 1. The purpose, need for, and requirements of this program, including the basic concept that gives every employee the right to know about hazardous chemicals to which they may be exposed while at work. 2. The location and availability of the written hazard communication program, the list of hazardous chemicals, and their corresponding MSDSs. Laboratory employees shall be informed of the location and availability of the written chemical hygiene plan. Employee information will also include 3. The identity upon request of any chemical to which the employee is exposed. In the case of a trade secret chemical, the name shown on the MSDS will be provided. And finally, number 4. Employee information will include operations where employee exposure to hazardous chemicals may occur. This completes employee training on hazard communication. Your training will now continue with Initial Employee Training on the Globally Harmonized System. Remember, we will be covering a lot of information on a number of slides. Feel free to pause or rewind this video should you wish to review. The remainder of this presentation pertains to the recent changes to OSHA's Hazard Communication Standard. These changes were brought about with the adoption by OSHA of the Globally Harmonized System, or the GHS. GHS is a system for globally standardizing and harmonizing the classification and labeling of chemicals. It is a logical and comprehensive approach to defining the health, physical, and environmental hazards of chemicals, creating classification processes that use available data on chemicals for comparison with the defined hazard criteria, and communicating hazard information as well as protective measures on a label and a safety data sheet, or an SDS. The SDS will eventually replace the Material Safety Data Sheet, or MSDS. The GHS itself is not a regulation or a standard. The GHS document, referred to as the Purple Book, establishes agreed hazard classification and communication provisions with explanatory information on how to apply the system. The elements in the GHS supply a mechanism to meet the basic requirements of any hazard communication system, which is to decide if the chemical product produced and/or supplied is hazardous, and to prepare a label and/or safety data sheet as appropriate. Regulatory authorities in countries adopting the GHS will take the agreed criteria and provisions and implement them through their own regulatory process and procedures. The U.S. has done this through OSHA's Right to Know, or Hazard Communication Standard, which is Title 29, Code of Federal Regulations 1910.1200. It is anticipated that application of the GHS will enhance the protection of human health and the environment by providing an internationally comprehensible system, provide a recognized framework to develop regulations for those countries without existing systems, facilitate international trade in chemicals whose hazards have been identified on an international basis, and reduce the need for testing and evaluation against multiple classification systems. The tangible benefits to governments are fewer chemical accidents and incidents, lower health care costs, improved protection of workers and the public from chemical hazards, avoiding duplication of efforts in creating national systems, reduction in the costs of enforcement, and improved reputation on chemical issues, both domestically and internationally. The three major areas of change are in hazard classification, labels, and safety data sheets. Hazard classification. The definitions of hazards have been changed to provide specific criteria for classification of health and physical hazards, as well as classification of mixtures. These specific criteria will help to ensure that evaluations of hazardous effects are consistent across manufacturers around the world, and help ensure labels and safety data sheets are more accurate as well. Labels. Chemical manufacturers and importers will be required to provide a shipping label that includes a harmonized signal word, a pictogram, and hazard statement for each hazard class and category. Safety data sheets, formerly material safety data sheets, will now have a specified 16-section format. We'll talk more about safety data sheets a little later on in this presentation. Here are a few key words when relating to hazard communication and the globally harmonized system. Class, the hazard or hazards assigned to a product. Category, once classified, the degree of danger represented by the hazard of a particular product. These ratings range from Category 1, Great Danger, to Category 5, Low Danger. Pictogram, the symbol or sign used to identify the class or hazards assigned to a product on the warning label. Signal word is the word danger or warning that will appear as part of the warning label. It indicates the degree of hazard the product possesses. Hazard statements are standardized statements that will appear as part of the hazard communication system, identifying just what hazards the user should be aware of. Precautionary statements are standardized statements and/or pictogram which describe recommended measures that should be taken to minimize adverse effects resulting from exposures to a hazardous product, or improper storage or handling of a hazardous product. SDS, safety data sheets. These will eventually replace the material safety data sheet. These are sheets or a booklet that describe the hazards of the product and give details about safe handling and responding to emergencies. Under the GHS classification, there are three basic classes of hazards. Physical, the material's flammability or reactivity. Health, the immediate and long-term toxicity hazards. And environmental, relating to the material's toxicity to aquatic organisms, potential to bioaccumulate or persist in the environment, and things hazardous to the ozone layer. Physical hazards include explosives, flammable gases, flammable aerosols, oxidizing gases, gases under pressure, flammable liquids, flammable solids. Self-reactive substances. These are thermally unstable and may break down when heated. Pyrophoric liquids and solids. These ignite spontaneously at room temperature or below. Self-heating substances. They react with oxygen and start to burn. Water-reactive substances. Oxidizing liquids and solids. These cause ignition of other materials by chemical reaction, or can increase the heat and speed of a fire. Organic peroxides are oxidized with a special chemical structure that tends to make them unstable. And corrosives, which are, of course, corrosive to metal. Health hazards include acute toxicity and chronic toxicity. Under acute toxicity, which means immediate hazards, there's immediate toxicity. This is immediate and serious health effects, possibly including death, on exposure. Corrode, or burning of the skin and eyes. Irritation, meaning significant irritation to skin and eyes. Under chronic toxicity, which is long-term hazards, there's carcinogenicity, or cancer-causing. Germ cell mutagenicity. They cause mutations or genetic change to germ cells in the body. Reproductive toxicity, affecting the reproductive system, for example, in birth defects or sterility. Skin and or respiratory sensitization, things which cause allergic reactions to the skin or respiratory system on exposure. Target organ effects. Certain chemicals can attack certain parts of the body, either on a single exposure or repeated exposure. For example, prolonged exposure to asbestos affects the lungs. Many dry cleaning chemicals attack the liver and kidneys even after a single exposure. Aspiration hazards. These are materials entering the lungs which cause a serious inflammation called pneumonitis, which can be fatal. Many petroleum-based products and solvents may be aspiration hazards. Environmental hazards include U.S. EPA hazardous substance criteria, existing IMDG marine pollutant criteria, European Union criteria used in ADR RID transportation regulations, materials which are hazardous to the ozone layer, including aquatic hazards with acute or chronic toxicity, and bioaccumulation. These are toxins that accumulate faster than they can be eliminated. Because OSHA does not have jurisdiction over environmental hazards, OSHA treats this class as non-mandatory. It may be covered by other agencies once those decisions have been made. Categories. The category assigned to a hazardous material reflects the degree of danger represented by the hazard of that particular product. The categories are ranked 1 through 5, with a Category 1 material being most hazardous, and a Category 5 least hazardous, which could mean it's only hazardous to a vulnerable segment of population, for example, small children or people with compromised immune systems. Categories may be further subdivided, for example, Category 1A, 1B, 1C, etc. Explosive hazards are designated by divisions. The less dangerous categories may not be regulated in all modes in all countries. This table shows how a material is assigned a hazard category using the GHS. Note, a very small amount, 0 to 5 milligrams per kilogram of body weight taken orally of an acutely toxic substance yields an LD50. This means the lethal dose kills 50% of the tested population. This results in assigning to that chemical a hazard category 1, the most hazardous designation. The example here, cyanide. The different parts or elements of a GHS shipping label include the product identifier, the chemical name or trade name, The new hazard pictogram will also be on the shipping label. The signal words, danger or warning, hazard statements, supplier identify, that's supplier information, like name, address, phone number of the manufacturer or distributor. Not required on the label at this time, precautionary information, and chemical identity. Classification, or the class and category of the chemical, is what drives labeling. Information should be conveyed in more than one way, both symbols and text. GHS standardized elements, which means the elements of the shipping label that are not subject to variation no matter the manufacturer or country, include the symbol, or hazard pictogram, signal word, hazard statements, and precautionary statements. Here are the new GHS pictograms that will be used on shipping labels. You'll probably start seeing these on secondary or workplace container labels before too long. Click pause at this point and study the pictograms for a while. What do the pictograms on this label tell you about acetone? It's okay. You can go back a slide if you want to. Acetone is a flammable and a skin and eye irritant. Signal words. Only two words are used, danger or warning, to emphasize the hazard and differentiate between the degrees of hazard. Danger is used for higher hazard materials and warning for lower level hazards. Hazard statement. GHS assigns a single, harmonized statement for each level of hazard within each hazard class. For example, a particular flammable liquid may be assigned a Category 1, which means both its liquid and vapor are extremely flammable. A Category 2, highly flammable liquid and vapor. Category 3, flammable liquid and vapor. And a Category 4, it's a combustible liquid. Precautionary statements. This element is not yet mandatory in the U.S. as of April 2012. Mandatory or recommended inclusion of precautionary statements on the label will be left up to the individual country. Note: only those label elements identified with a red arrow are currently required under the GHS labeling system. The chemical or product trade name serves as the product identifier, and manufacturers should identify the hazardous ingredients where appropriate. Here's another sample of a GHS shipping label. Click pause here and look it over for a while. Here's where you're likely to find the new GHS labels. Workplace labels. The new hazcom standard maintains the flexible approach to workplace labels as in the old standard. For example, the GHS label does not have to be on all workplace containers. Workplace labels will be reviewed to make sure they still convey the correct hazards and other information called for by the new requirements. NFPA and HMIS labels are permitted. However, the information provided must be consistent with the new hazard communication standard. Confidential business information, or CBI, formerly known as trade secrets. CBI exemptions will not be harmonized under GHS. Control will be left to the individual countries. Provisions for CBI should not compromise the health and safety of users. Non-disclosure names should be limited to the names of chemicals and their concentrations in mixtures. And mechanisms should be established for disclosure in emergency and non-emergency situations, by way of manufacturer emergency number or ChemTrek. Chemical manufacturers, importers, or employers may withhold specific information from the SDS, but they must be able to support that the information withheld is a trade secret. Under the North Carolina Right to Know law, hazard information on chemicals deemed as a trade secret are to be provided to the local fire chief, who shall hold the information in confidence. Emergencies. Where a treating physician or nurse determines that a medical emergency exists, the chemical identity and/or specific percentage of the composition of the trade secret must be disclosed. Non-emergencies. Trade secrets may be disclosed to health professionals if it's requested in writing, the secret is used to assess an employee's exposure, to help provide medical treatment, and to assist in designing engineering controls. Continuing with non-emergency situations, the trade secret may be disclosed to health professionals also if assessing hazards, or conducting medical surveillance, or assessing PPE needs, or conducting medical studies. Safety Data Sheets, or SDS, formerly MSDS, Material Safety Data Sheet. The SDS will provide comprehensive information about a chemical substance or mixture, including composition, major hazards, safe handling, and emergency response. The new SDS will be in a standardized format with 16 headings. Number 1, Identification, Product and Supplier. Number 2, Hazard Information, GHS classification and GHS labeling statements. Number 3, Product composition and basic information on ingredients, including the CAS number. 4, First aid measures. 5, Firefighting measures. 6, Accidental release measures. 7, Safe handling and storage requirements. 8, Exposure controls and personal protective equipment. 9, Physical and chemical properties summary. 10, Stability and reactivity summary. 11, Toxicological information, carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, and reproductive effects. 12, Ecological information, toxicity to aquatic organisms and biodegradability. 13, Disposal considerations. 14, Transport information. 15, Regulatory information. And 16, Other information, relevant information not given elsewhere on the SDS. Note, all safety data sheets, regardless of country, will contain these 16 informational headings. Sections 12 through 15 are not mandatory since they address information outside OSHA's jurisdiction. Chemical manufacturers and importers shall obtain or develop an SDS. Employers shall have an SDS in the workplace for each chemical they use, and they must be in English. Chemical manufacturers or importers shall ensure that distributors and employers are provided an appropriate SDS with their initial shipment and with the first shipment after an SDS is updated. Please note, OSHA Standard 1910.1020 defines an employee exposure record to include the MSDS SDS. In the absence of an MSDS SDS, a chemical inventory list must be included. The medical record for each employee shall be preserved and maintained for at least the duration of employment plus 30 years, and employees have the right and must be given the opportunity to examine and copy their exposure record. Information in this presentation comes from the following resources: Occupational Safety and Health Administration, Federal OSHA, North Carolina Occupational Safety and Health, Alfred University Environmental Health and Safety, U.S. Army Medical Department, Meridian Energy and Environment, and ASU's EHS and EM. For further information or to suggest changes to this program, please contact the Hazard Communication Program Monitor, Mary Cavanaugh, University Industrial Hygienist at 262-6838, or cavanaughmm@avstate.edu. This concludes your hazcom training for today. Thank you for completing the online hazard communication course. Now, get credit for it. Click the quiz link on the web page, complete the quiz, and then click the Submit button to send it to EHS and EM. Again, thank you for your participation. Think more, risk less.